I want to tell you about an argument I had on X, formerly known as Twitter, with a young woman I've been following since the late 2010s. Back then, she posted sharp takes on politics and culture, thoughtful even. But somewhere between then and now, something's changed. By the time I noticed, her timeline was full of slurs, conspiracy rhetoric, and the kind of casual racial content that used to get you run up. That used to get you run up the internet, essentially. So she wasn't some anonymous troll. She was Ann Coulter's niece. And that detail matters, not because of who her aunt is, but because it illustrates something important. Radicalization isn't just happening in the dark forms of the internet. It's happening to people with real social capital, real family connections to mainstream conservatism, real names attached to their accounts. The pipeline is that visible now. The question I want to answer in this video is simple. Why are young people in particular so vulnerable to this process? I think there are 4 reasons. 1, the collapse of traditional gatekeepers. The first is the collapse of traditional gatekeepers. For most of the 20th century, there were institutions standing between a person with extreme views and mass audience. Editors, producers, network executives, publishers. You didn't get to speak to thousands of people unless someone with institutional authority decided you were worth platforming. That system had real problems. It was exclusionary. It privileged certain voices over others, and it was often more concerned with maintaining consensus than pursuing truth. But it also functioned as a filter. The most extreme voices had a structural disadvantage because the gatekeepers, wherever their flaws, generally didn't want to be associated with open bigotry. The internet dissolved that, not overnight but steadily, and then all at once. By the mid-2010s, a teenager with a camera and a YouTube account had access to a potential audience of millions with no institutional intermediary required. That genuinely democratized information in many ways. But it also meant that the most extreme voices, the ones willing to say what polite society wouldn't, gained a structural advantage. Outrage travels faster than nuance. Provocation gets more clicks. The algorithm doesn't distinguish between engagement driven by inspiration and engagement driven by disgust. It just optimizes for the time on the platform. Without gatekeeper, the floor dropped out, and young people were growing up on these platforms as the primary media environment. Had no prior reference point for what responsible information architecture even looked like. The second is anonymity. Or more precisely, selective anonymity the internet provides, where you're anonymous enough to say anything, but visible enough to build an identity around it. The combination is particularly dangerous for young people, still in the process of forming the worldview. Identity in adolescence and early adulthood is experimental by nature. You try things out, you perform versions of yourself, and see what gets reflected back. Offline, that process is moderated by social consequences. Say something cruel, and the people around you react. That reaction shapes you. Online, the feedback loop is different. You're not getting social correction from the people who know you. You're getting likes and follows, and replies from strangers who share your views. And that audience can calcify what shoved them to phase into a permanent worldview. The anonymity also functions as a moral release valve. These people would never say in a workplace, a classroom, or a family dinner. Yet they would never say these things at a workplace, a classroom, or a family dinner, yet get to say it freely online because the normal social consequences are suspended. For young people who are already primed towards risk taking and boundary testing, which is developmentally normal, that release valve can accelerate and drift towards views might otherwise have moderated on their own. Next is the alienating effect of remote communication. You know, the way that arguing online strips out the friction that moderates use in person. When you disagree with someone face to face, you're not just processing the argument, you're reading their body language, you're feeling social pressure, you're aware of them as a full human being with life and history and stakes in the conversation. And that awareness doesn't always change your mind, but contains how far you're willing to go. There are things most people won't say to another face to face that they'll type without hesitation. Online, all that is gone. What remains is pure abstraction. The idea, the slur, the meme, detached from the human being it's directed at. And when your primary experience of political disagreement happens in that dehumanized register, it reshapes how you think about the people on the other side of these disagreements. They stop being people you disagree with and start being abstractions you're at war with. For a generation that has grown up with the internet, with only online interaction as the primary social environment, this is an occasional mode they slip into. It's the default, the baseline, the why are they snowman. Next is the globalization of white identitarianism. This fourth reason is the one I think gets most understood, and it's the one that ties everything together. White identitarianism has gone global, and it specifically deliberately recruits youth. This isn't the Klan holding meetings in church basements. This isn't skinheads in the parking lot. What emerged over the last 15 years is something far more sophisticated. A transnational movement with a shared aesthetic. A coordinated content pipeline, cross-platform recruiting infrastructure, and an ideological framework carefully engineered to appeal to a generation of young people who were left behind by the world they were promised. The movement understood something early that mainstream politics took years to grasp. YouTube was a radicalization machine if you used it correctly. The pathway was really direct. You didn't start by watching explicit white nationalist content. You start with a comedian who pushed boundaries, or a culture critic who complained about political correctness, or a self-help guru who told young men that the world owed them discipline, not sympathy. Each of these creators exists in a broader ecosystem, and the algorithm connected them. Watching up anti-woke content and the recommendations gradually drift. The overturned window doesn't move that all at once. It slides, video by video, into content that would have seemed extreme 2 years ago now feels like common sense. Researchers call this the rabbit hole effect. But it wasn't just algorithmic accident. There were actors who understood the typology of that rabbit hole and deliberately positioned themselves inside it, creating content designed to function as a waypoint on the journey toward hard ideology. That ideology itself was engineered for youth consumption. It borrowed the language of oppression from the very movements it opposed. Young white men weren't being asked to celebrate dominance. They were being asked that they were victims of affirmative action, victims of feminism, victims of immigration, victims of a globalist elite that replaced them in the culture, or replacing them in the economy, and eventually to replace them demographically. The Great Replacement wasn't a fringe conspiracy. It was a recruitment pitch dressed in the glamour of social justice. It borrowed production values from mainstream YouTube culture. High quality editing, tight scripting, charismatic hosts, merch, inside jokes, a sense of community. If you were a lonely 17-year-old who felt like the culture had no place for you, this content didn't feel like hate. It felt like belonging. It borrowed the urgency of genuine anxiety. And this bar is important because it's missing youth radicalization as pure stupidity of pure evil misses something real. A generation of young people, particularly young men without college degrees, watched as their economic prospects narrowed, the communities hollowed out, their social status declined, relative to the fathers and the grandfathers. That anxiety is legitimate. The identitarian movement didn't create it, it captured it, took the real pain and gave you a fake villain. And it did all of this across borders simultaneously. The same rhetorical framework circulated from American podcasts to British YouTube channels to Australian image boards to German Telegram groups. Nick Fuentes was being discussed in London. Tommy Robinson's framings were being adopted in the American Midwest. The Christchurch shooters posted a manifesto that read like a document assembled for a dozen different national contexts, stitched together into one. This was not coincidence. The movement has always understood itself as international, because its core narrative that white Western civilization faces an existential threat requires an international frame to function. What made youth particularly vulnerable to all this wasn't stupidity, it was developmental timing. Adolescence and early childhood are the periods when identity is most plastic, when belonging matters most, when the needs for a coherent worldview is most acute. The identitarian movement offered all three: an identity, a community, and a totalizing explanation for everything wrong in your life. And it reached young people during those exact years through the platforms they're already living on and the content formats they're already consuming. Now, conclusion. Ann Coulter's niece did not stumble into a hate movement. She was walked there step by step by a pipeline that knew exactly what it was doing. The collapse of gay people gave that pipeline access. Anonymity gave it cover. Remote communication stripped out the human friction that might have slowed it down. The pipeline itself, the strategy, the content, the recruitment architecture, that was built by people who look at the generation of anxious online identity-seeking young people and saw an opportunity. That's the part that should disturb you the most. Not the radicalization happening, but that for this moment, it was never a side effect. It was always the point. What you can do. So what can you do about it? I'm not going to tell you to simply log off. That's not realistic, and frankly, it cedes territory to the people who are most willing to abuse it. The internet isn't going anywhere. These platforms aren't going anywhere. The young people most at risk are being radicalized aren't going anywhere either. What I will tell you is this: awareness is not enough. This is where everything else starts. If you have a young person in your life, a sibling, a cousin, a student, a kid in your community, pay attention to what they're consuming, and who they're becoming inside of it. Not in a surveillance way, but in a relationship way. The single most consistent finding in de-radicalization research is that the people who pull someone back from the edge are almost never institutions. They're almost always individuals. Someone who maintained a relationship with someone who kept showing up, someone who made the cost of full radicalization feel too high because there was something real on the other side it was worth protecting. If your creator If you make content, if you have a platform, if you have an audience, understand that you are operating inside the same ecosystem that the Ethereum movement built its pipeline through. That's not an accusation, it's a structural reality, which means the choices you make about what you platform, who you amplify, and what rhetorical moves you normalize actually matter. The rabbit hole wasn't built by extremists alone. It was built by 1,000 incremental choices made by people who thought they were just being edgy, just being honest, just pushing back up against political correctness. You don't have to be a propagandist to be useful to a propaganda ecosystem. You just have to be careful. And finally, if you recognize yourself in any part of what I described today, if you feel that pull toward a worldview that told you and your anger had a face, your anxiety had cause, and your alienation meant something, and your alienation meant, if you felt that way toward a worldview that told you your anger had a face, your anxiety had a cause, and your alienation meant you were one of the chosen few who finally saw the truth, I'm not here to shame you. That pipeline was designed by professionals to catch people like you at exactly the moment you were most vulnerable. Recognizing it for what it is isn't weakness. It's the first move towards getting out from under it. The movement's counted on you staying isolated, staying online, staying in the rabbit hole. Proving them wrong is its own form of resistance. If this video made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want to keep having these conversations, and drop a comment below. Have you seen this pipeline operating in your own life or in someone you know? Let's talk about it.